Out in the far stretch of Wyoming territory where the wind whispered more than most folks ever dared say aloud, there lived a man named Silas McGraw. He didn't talk much, didn't laugh much, and didn't ask for company. The folks in town whispered about him, that rancher with no kin, no wife, no children. They said he was born with bad luck in his blood, that after the war took his brother and the fever took his wife, Silas just stopped expecting life to give him anything worth keeping. And then one night in a smoky saloon filled with too much whiskey and too little mercy, he won a hand of poker. And with it, a girl, a teenage girl, traded like a joke by a man too cruel to be called kin and too cowardly to call himself a father. The girl sat silent in the corner, hands folded like prayer eyes, far too tired for someone her age. She had no say in the game, no idea where the card table would lead her, and neither did Silas, because he didn't want a child, didn't need a servant, couldn't even imagine being anyone's guardian, not when he couldn't have children of his own, and not when his heart still ached from everything he'd already lost. But when he looked at her, thin shoulders, bruised wrists, lips pressed tight to hold back whatever words she learned, never to say, something inside him shifted. Not pity, not rescue, something quieter than both. Something like recognition. This isn't a love story in the way people expect. It's a story about dignity, about how two broken people, one too old to believe in second chances and one too young to think she deserved one, slowly taught each other what care, patience, and trust could look like in a world that had long since forgotten how to offer them. So if you've ever wondered what happens when someone completely unwanted finds themselves in the quiet company of someone equally alone, stay close. Because what happened next wasn't loud. It didn't make headlines, but it changed both of their lives forever. Have you ever seen someone who didn't expect to be chosen finally be treated like they mattered? This story is for you. Stay with us, because sometimes what begins as a mistake at the poker table turns into the most unexpected kind of redemption. The night she was won in a poker game, Josie Clay was just 16. The saloon smelled of sweat, spilled whiskey, and something worse, regret that had nowhere to go. She stood in the corner, wrapped in her mother's old shawl, arms folded tight across her stomach. Men laughed and clinked glasses. The piano had gone quiet. And then the rancher said, "I'll call your hand and raise you the girl." The room fell still. Someone coughed. Another muttered, "You can't bet a human." But the man who placed the wager? Harlan Tate, her stepfather, just grinned and leaned back in his chair. "She ain't mine by blood, just eating my bread and taking up space. One way or another, she's leaving with someone tonight." Across the table sat Silas McGraw, a broad-shouldered man in his 40s with frost-bitten fingers, a permanent frown, and a history as long as the railroad. They called him the Quiet One, a rancher, widowed, no children. Rumors said he was sterile. Others whispered that it wasn't his body that was barren, but his heart. He didn't answer right away, just looked at Josie, and not the way the others had, not the way Harlan did, like something to throw away. His look was slower, sadder, like he was staring at a mirror he didn't expect to find. "I don't want trouble," Silas said finally. Then fold, Harlan spat, but Silas didn't fold, and he didn't smile when he laid down 4 queens. Harlan cursed, threw down his cards, reached for his drink. Then just like that, he shoved Josie forward and stormed out, muttering something about a girl not even worth losing. She stood frozen. The room didn't erupt in cheers. No one clapped. No one congratulated the man who had just won a girl. Silas rose slowly, brushing his coat sleeve, walked to Josie. She flinched as he reached for her, but all he did was hand her a coat. "It's cold outside," he said. That was the beginning. No declarations, no rescue, just a coat, a silence, and the long ride back to a ranch neither of them quite belonged to. What happens when a girl traded like a debt is met not with pity, but with silence that listens. The first morning on Silas McGraw's ranch didn't begin with words, just wind. It pushed through the pine boards and creaked the shutters. Josie sat on the edge of a stiff cot wrapped in the wool coat Silas had given her, her boots still muddy from the ride. The room was bare: one small dresser, a basin, and a window that looked out over frost-covered hills. She hadn't been given a lock for the door, but no one came. Downstairs she heard the scrape of a chair, the sound of a tin cup on wood, then nothing. She didn't want to go down. She didn't want to stay either. At Harlan's she'd learned to move without sound, learned to stay invisible unless summoned, learned that stillness could be safety. But this new quiet, it wasn't threatening. It was just wide. Eventually she climbed down the ladder and crept into the kitchen. Silas sat at the table reading from a worn book. His face was unreadable, like it had been carved from the same wood as the beams above him. In front of him sat a second plate, a boiled egg, a slice of bread, a cup of water. He didn't gesture for her to sit, but he didn't eat either. Only after she sat did he say, "You sleep." Josie nodded. Good. That was the entire conversation, but it was more than she was used to. By the third day, Josie learned the rhythm of the ranch. Wake at dawn, feed the chickens, sweep the porch, tend the firewood. Silas never told her what to do, but the tasks revealed themselves. He worked from sunup to sundown fixing fences, tending horses, hauling feed. And though he rarely spoke, he never barked, never raised a hand, never asked for anything she didn't offer freely. One afternoon, she found an old journal in the loft, empty pages, dusty cover. She held it in her lap that night, unsure if she'd dare write in it. What would she say? I am here, but I do not know if I belong. A week passed before Silas finally asked her a question that wasn't about chores. They were stacking kindling in the woodshed when he said, "What do you want to do?" Josie blinked. I mean, when all this settles, what's your plan? She didn't answer, because she didn't know, because no one had ever asked, not once, not ever. She looked at him, squinting into the cold. I don't know, she said. Silas nodded. Then we'll figure it out. And that was it. No lectures, no promises. Just the strange comfort of someone willing to stand beside her in the not knowing. That night, as she lit the lantern by the window, she caught her reflection in the glass. She still looked small, still looked young. But for the first time in a long while, she didn't look like something forgotten. She looked visible. What begins to heal when someone finally asks you what you want and listens for the answer, no matter how quiet spring in the high plains, came slow melting snow in patches, leaving mud and silence behind. The ranch looked less like a home and more like a question Josie still didn't know how to answer. By then she had lived in Silas McGraw's house for 3 weeks, and not once had he touched her. Not once had he locked a door or given her a command. She worked because she chose to, ate because he set out food without a word, slept in a room where she could close the door without fear. But kindness, when you've lived without it, can be the hardest thing to trust. And Josie didn't trust it. Not really. She watched Silas with suspicion tucked behind her eyes, studied his movements the way you study a loaded gun, carefully, quietly. Even his silence made her wary, because Harlan used to go quiet right before he got mean. So when Silas said nothing, she waited for the blow that never came. Until one morning when the kettle boiled over and she startled so hard she dropped the pan, spilling hot oats across the stove. She scrambled to clean it, hands trembling. I'm sorry, I'll fix it. Please don't. But Silas didn't raise his voice. He didn't stand. He didn't even frown. He just said gently, It's all right, Josie. You're safe. 2 words. You're safe. And that's when the tears came, angry, embarrassed, uninvited. She didn't want to cry in front of him, didn't want to look like a child, but the weight of everything she'd been carrying, every blow, every night she went to bed, afraid every time she'd had to tell herself, just survive it, cracked something open. I don't know how to be here, she whispered. Silas nodded slowly. That's okay. You don't have to know. That night, Josie sat outside on the porch with a blanket pulled around her shoulders. The moon was thin and pale. The wind carried the sound of distant wolves. Silas came out and sat 2 planks away. You ever ride? He asked. She shook her head. Harlan said girls with mouths too small for opinions had no business on horses. Silas didn't laugh. He just said, Well, good thing you ain't there anymore. Then he handed her something, a book, weathered pages, soft from use. Jane Eyre. It was my wife's, he said. You can keep it, or not, up to you. Josie clutched it to her chest like a lifeline. But the next day the piece they'd been building cracked. A rider came up the road, one of Harlan's old drinking friends. He dismounted, spat in the dust, and smirked. "McGraw," he called. "How's that poker prize holding up?" Silas's face didn't change. "Get off my land." The man just laughed. "She's still crying at night, or you broken her in already?" Before Josie could react, Silas stepped forward and said low and sharp, "You say another word and you'll be walking home without teeth." The man didn't stay long, but the damage was done. Josie saw herself again the way the world had always seen her. Not as a girl, not as a person, just a joke in a pot. She went inside, slammed the door, and didn't come out until morning. When someone sees your worth, but the world keeps calling you worthless, which voice do you believe so far? How has this story made you feel? Have you ever met someone who gave you space to heal, but your wounds made it hard to believe them? Have you ever been offered kindness and flinched? Josie's journey isn't just about escaping the past. It's about learning to trust peace after a lifetime of pain. But the road to healing is never straight. The world that once sold her like a bet isn't done whispering lies. And now with the walls closing in, she'll have to decide, will she run or will she stay with us? The next part is where everything begins to shift. Josie didn't speak to Silas for 2 days. Not out of anger, but fear. Fear that he'd seen what she really was underneath, scared, damaged, uncertain. The man on the horse had reminded her too well of who the world said she was, a girl who could be won, mocked, discarded. But Silas didn't knock on her door. Didn't force a talk. He just made sure the fire was lit each night, left breakfast on the table each morning. And then on the third day, something changed. She stepped into the barn and found a saddle on the ground. Not on a horse, just there waiting. Silas was brushing down the mare, his back to her. "You said you'd never ridden," he said quietly. She nodded. He glanced over his shoulder. "But you didn't say you never wanted to." Josie hesitated, then whispered, "I always wanted to." Silas motioned to the saddle. "Then let's start there." It took weeks, first just learning to be near the horse, then to walk beside it, then eventually to swing a leg over the side without feeling like the ground might pull her back. Her hands shook, her voice faltered. But every time she slipped, Silas was just there. No praise, no pity, just presence. And one afternoon after she'd ridden 20 yards on her own, he looked up and said, "That mare trusts you." Josie blinked. "Why? She sees how careful you are, how you wait. Horses know what people forget: kindness is a strength." But it wasn't all gentle mornings. One night a letter arrived from the sheriff in a nearby town. Harlan Tate had written a formal claim accusing Silas of harboring a minor taken under false pretenses, demanding she be returned. Silas placed the letter on the table between them. "I can fight this," he said. "I've got the law on my side and witnesses to what happened. But you need to know this might not stay quiet." Josie stared at the letter, her hands balled into fists. "I don't want to go back," she said. "I can't." Silas nodded. "Then we won't let him take you." She looked at him, trembling. "But what if he comes here? What if they believe him?" And this time Silas didn't say anything right away. He just walked over, picked up a photo frame from the shelf. It was his wife. Brown eyes, gentle smile. She never wanted to fight either, he said. But when the cattle rustlers came one winter, she stood with a rifle and told them, "Not today." He met Josie's eyes. "If you want to stay, you won't have to fight alone." That night, Josie wrote in the journal again. Just 3 words. "I am staying." What happens when the place you were forced into becomes the place you'd fight to protect? Silas didn't build fences around Josie. He didn't give her rules, didn't lay out expectations like a man might for someone he thought he owned. He simply shared the ranch, and that, more than anything, taught her what freedom felt like. Still, she stayed cautious. Freedom, when it came too suddenly, could feel like falling. But Josie had grown tired of waiting for someone to give her permission to live. So one morning she rose before the sun, before the roosters, before even Silas stirred. She saddled the mare herself. No help, no lesson. She rode out past the low hills through a stretch of open field she'd only ever seen from the porch. Her heart beat fast. The wind tugged her coat like a child asking to play. Her breath caught not in fear, but in wonder. She was riding by herself because she chose to. When she returned covered in dust and smiling without realizing it, Silas looked up from the woodpile and said only one word. Good. That was all she needed. Later that day, Josie walked into town for the first time alone. She'd avoided it until now. Too many memories. Too many whispers. But today she wore her courage like armor and stepped into the mercantile. The shopkeeper gave her a sideways glance. "You're McGraw's girl," Josie met his eyes. "No," she said. "I work on his ranch." That distinction mattered. She wasn't someone's prize. She wasn't someone's possession. She was someone who chose to stay. On the way home, she passed the churchyard where townsfolk were placing flowers on graves. She stopped by a small white cross tucked near the tree line. No name on it, just a wooden angel carved by hand. An older woman nearby noticed her gaze. "That was Silas's wife," she said. "Died from fever 5 years back. He built the marker himself." Josie nodded. "She was young too," the woman added. "Can't imagine how he's carried that grief." Josie looked down. Her fingers curled at her sides. Grief had many forms. Hers just happened while still breathing. That evening after dinner, she finally asked him, "Why didn't you send me away?" Silas stirred the fire. "Did you want me to?" "No. I mean, yes. I didn't expect to stay. I thought you'd see me and change your mind." He looked at her, then really looked. "You came here scared and you stayed anyway. That's not something I send away." She blinked. "But I was never meant to be here." "Neither was I," he said softly. "Not after my wife passed. But here we are." Before bed, she opened her journal. She wrote, "The girl who was traded in a poker game just bought her own boots. And tomorrow I'm asking Silas to teach me how to shoot. When a girl who once belonged to no one finally claims herself, what does that kind of freedom look like? And who might it threaten?" The sheriff arrived the next afternoon, not with handcuffs, not with a warrant, just with questions and a folded letter bearing the signature of Harlan Tate. Josie saw him ride up from the kitchen window. Her spine stiffened. Her hands instinctively reached for the edge of the table, bracing for anything to go wrong. Silas didn't panic. He simply walked out to greet the lawman. Sheriff Whitley was a square-jawed man with too many winters behind his eyes. He dismounted with a slow grace, glancing toward Josie as she stepped onto the porch. "You the girl?" he asked. "I'm Josie," she answered. He squinted. "You here by choice?" She nodded. "I am." He sighed through his mustache. "Mr. Tate claims you were taken illegally, that you were underage and he had papers." Silas's jaw tensed. "She's 17, and the only thing Harlan ever signed was a drinking tab." The sheriff didn't smile. He just opened the envelope and held out a piece of paper. "Birth record. Says she's 16. Josie's heart dropped. She felt her knees wobble, not because of the number, but because of what it meant. Because suddenly this place, this safety, this life she was only just beginning to trust it might be taken. The sheriff looked between them. "Girl, I can't ignore this, not if the papers hold. But I'll give you until morning to make a case. If you leave now, I'll log it as a family dispute, nothing more. But if you stay and we press, this becomes law." Josie looked to Silas, but Silas didn't speak for her. He simply said, "It's your choice." And for the first time, she believed it. That night, Josie walked alone to the horse paddock. Stars scattered like prayers across the sky. She leaned against the fence post and whispered, "God, if you're real, don't let them take me." The truth was she'd grown older this year, not by birthdays, but by battles. And she was tired not just of running, but of not belonging. Silas joined her after a while, standing in silence beside her. Then he said quietly, "There's something I didn't tell you." Josie turned. "I can't have children," he said. "Doctors confirmed it years ago." She blinked. "I never told anyone, not even my wife. We kept hoping, praying, but nothing ever came." His voice cracked just slightly. "When they traded you to me in that game, I thought God was mocking me, giving me something I couldn't want, couldn't need. But now I think maybe he was showing me I still had something to give." Josie said nothing, but in that moment the girl who had once been a burden began to understand her value. Not as a daughter, not as a wife, but as someone who changed a man's silence into love. The next morning when the sheriff returned, Josie stepped down from the porch herself. She held out the birth paper and said, "This says I'm 16. It's wrong." He raised a brow. You have proof? She nodded. Yes, sir. I was born during a flood. The records were filed late. My mama kept the church baptism letter. You'll find the real date there. Sheriff Whitley studied her, then looked to Silas. You sure you're up for this? Silas said only, I'll stand beside her. Whitley left. No handcuffs, no threats. Just the quiet weight of justice leaning toward the truth. That night, Josie wrote, the man who couldn't be a father taught me how to fight like a daughter. When the world tries to erase your freedom, will you be ready to stand not just for yourself, but for the person who finally saw your worth? Spring arrived late in Wyoming that year. The wind still bit at the mornings, but tiny blades of green pushed up from the cold earth like a promise not forgotten. Josie stood barefoot on the porch one afternoon, her hem brushing the wooden planks Silas had sanded smooth last fall. The sun warmed her toes. Her heart warmed itself. 3 months had passed since the sheriff rode away. No more letters, no more threats. Just life, real honest life. Silas offered to take her into town the day she turned 18. We can sign papers. Make something official, he said, voice as quiet as always. But Josie just looked at him and smiled. I already chose you, she said. I choose you every day. They didn't marry, not in the way the town expected. No white dress, no cake, no fanfare. Instead, they planted apple trees in the yard, built a fence for the chickens, repaired the old barn so it could hold calves come summer. And every evening, Josie sat beside Silas on the porch reading him pages from the journal she no longer needed to hide. One night, she placed the journal in his lap. I'm done writing in it, she said. He looked up. Why? Because I'm not surviving anymore, she said. I'm living. And that perhaps is the quiet miracle of their story. Not that Josie was rescued, not that Silas became whole through her presence, but that two people broken in ways no one else could see chose to stay. Chose to build, chose to heal, not by forgetting the past, but by honoring the courage it took to live through it. On the last page of her journal, Josie had written, I was once traded in a poker game, but now I choose my own hand. And every morning I wake beside a man who never once treated me like something to win, just someone worth holding on to. If this story stirred something in your heart, if you've ever believed you were too late, too broken, or too far gone to be truly chosen, let this be your reminder you are not what was done to you. You are who you become after. Would you like to hear more stories like Josie's? Leave a comment below and let us know. And if this journey meant something to you, closing, loved for the weight she carried. Cora Bell was once the punchline of someone else's cruelty, laughed at, discarded, deemed too much, too round, too old, too soft to be chosen. But in the stillness of a quiet ranch, beside a man who had lost more than most and spoken less than many, she was finally loved not despite who she was, but because of it. She wasn't asked to lose weight, or stay silent, or make herself smaller just to fit someone's world. She simply stayed with kindness, with courage, with quiet dignity. And in return, she was met by a man who didn't try to change her. He simply made room beside him. Maybe that's something you've longed for too. A place where you don't have to apologize for taking up space. A heart that says, you're not too much, you're just enough. If Cora's story touched something tender in you, would you like to hear more stories like hers? Leave a comment below. Tell us, have you ever been made to feel like too much for someone to love? And if this story brought you a little peace, a little warmth, please subscribe to None, Wild West Saga, and share this video with someone who needs to be reminded. You're not a mistake. You're a story worth staying for.